Come, my child, over there, guarded by an angel, treasure of the secrets of forbidden knowledge. There bleeds for corrupted hearts a strange vine, twined with the hissing snake of paradise lost. The angel sleeps when I wish. Come, my beautiful child, eat with wanton teeth the clusters where my mouth has bitten. Tomorrow you will know the cost of the wine and the power of the vintage your elder has sold you. You will watch yourself act and think and live. You will be at once the reader of the book, the obscure writer of that hideous book, and you will die very old, cultivating your pain, for having abdicated the scepter of your ignorance, which raised you to the height of heroes and gods. That was Initiation by the French poet Albert Giraud. That is what we are all about, we Gnostics and blasphemers and idolaters and gentle iconoclasts, cauterized in this tomb that is the body, or the soma sema in Greek as Plato called it. We are initiated into the mysteries of dark wonder, the painful joy of awakening to the Jezebel song of a higher state of being, and the legacy of our beloved spiritual ancestors martyred at the stakes by grand inquisitors or by the scalding pens of slanderous lamias.
Horror and moral terror are your friends.
We have taken an unbreakable oath to search the corners of inner and outer galaxies for the whispers of terrifying truths, descend into the lowest pits of a psychic Hades, armed with the sword of reason and the Orpheus harp of compassion for our dreams and imagination.
But where is it written that all our dreams must be small ones?
And the initiation is just the beginning of the end, because Rome and the Matrix and the furnaces of Dachau will hate us for our apostasy of nonconformity. With every step of spiritual maturity we dare, the November winds of intolerance will coal burn our faces, and the ground of our insecurities will shudder in determined fury. The graves will release the saints who will clod our cloaks and urge us to join their choir in their frozen heavens. There are no guarantees. There are no happy endings, perhaps. But we have taken an oath, the oath of the truth-seeker warrior. We have been initiated into the mysteries of dark wonder, of Hecate and Isis, of Seraphis and Jacques de Molay. We are the champion eternal, doomed and eventually forgotten, risen Christ cast aside by the Euphrates of capitalism, and a history written by anxious victors, a trembling Arjuna on his chariot, knowing the armies before him include friends that out to test everything he has become. But it doesn't matter. We forge ahead through those November winds, through the Normandy muck of pasts we are not proud of, through the skeletons of burned emotional libraries we once helped kindle, through empty cemeteries with the ghosts of those we hurt.
Forget the old ways, brother, all the old hatreds, all the old pains.
We have taken an oath, which we will speak through a blood-filled mouth, when Jehovah finally breaks our spine with his serpentine tail and flashes the game over sign over our tear-stained eyes.
Before this battle is over, the world will know that few stood against many.
And we will have won. Why? Because we are initiated. Because our spirit no longer belongs to the Lord and his banded legion of titans and television preachers. Because we fought the good fight, kept the faith, and almost finished the race. Because behind them and the hordes of chaos, a light arises like a pastel dawn in the shape of our mother, our true mother, a maiden-dressed Valkyrie, a winter muse and twilight goddess. And she will spread her sun-scarred arms to take us to the real dream, that dream of you, a starry constellation we once belonged to before we fell into the false dream of a mad god.
I made you, and I can wreck you just as easily.
And Jehovah will tighten his coils until our brightness almost goes out for good. We will choke on our profane words. We will reach out to Night Akamoth for one last effort. The coils tighten. Will Our Lady of the Late make it on time? Will that darkness at the edge of town descend over our higher senses before it's too late? Will it all begin again, over and over and over again? I don't know, my beloved truth seekers. I don't know.
There must be some kind of way out of here.
This is Aeon Byte. This is the virtual Alexandria. This is the God Above God.cam. This is approximately Saturday, November 6, 2009. I am and I am Abraxas, the terrible God above God as the ancients knew him, or as the Gnostic Gospel, Marsanus, refers to him, the one who exists, who is silent, who is above the heaven. I am his mortal incarnation of Miguel Connor. This is the rest of your life. Don't play hard to get. Okay, that was serious shiitake mushrooms. Let's discuss something with more levity, like hemorrhoids or the Cthulhu mythology, or the movie Brian's Song, shall we?
You find more cheer in a graveyard.
No, let's keep going one more step into another mystery that has been dared by so many true seeker warriors, religious or scientific, throughout the annals of man. A mystery that, if unlocked, can perhaps bring back that maiden dress Valkyrie once and for all. Perhaps. And that is the mystery of consciousness. Consciousness, the truly final and first frontier, paraphrasing the good captain who likes to show people his log.
Could he be any more pathetic?
A word, a concept we all take for granted, but know very little about it, even though it encompasses all that we are. And how can we truly know it if we are it? At least a small stream of it, coursing between mountains of the persistent illusion that is reality, and the possibilities of changing perception. Like I've quoted before from the beautiful Joseph Campbell, is the mind the vehicle of consciousness, or is consciousness the vehicle of the mind? Is there really an answer to this, or is this the perennial koan?
But what does that mean, Buddha?
Our astral guest in this eternal now heroically takes the battlefield with Arjuna to grant us a monumental insight into the mystery of consciousness, which if you look right now at, let's say, dictionary.cam, you'll find some pretty confusing and contradicting terminology. And that is Richard Smoley, author of such seminal books as Forbidden Faith, The Secret History of Gnosticism, Inner Christianity, Conscious Love, and The Dice Game of Shiva, his new work that deals with the mystery of consciousness.
It's all about raising consciousness.
Richard was also the editor of the classic Gnosis magazine for 8 years, and is now the editor of Quest Books, right here in Chicago. For more information on Richard, please visit his website, innerchristianity.com. And what a galvanic book is The Dice Game of Shiva. In less than 200 pages, Richard approaches our topic from so many prisms, including theological, philosophical, psychological, scientific, and, of course, esoteric. He takes us up the Jacob ladder of consciousness with such systems as the Hindu and Buddhist, the mystical Christian and Islamic, and the Gnostic and Kabbalist. He draws from the well of knowledge and speculation from such great souls as Socrates, Plato, Ramakrishna, Kant, Hume, Gurdjieff, and many, many others. He weaves heavy thinking with the lightness of mythology and invites us into palaces of understanding with the welcoming gesture of common sense and self-evident maxims. I haven't been this stimulated since Anna Kournikova, my beloved truth seekers.
Another day, another defilement.
To put it simply, And I don't want to or could actually steal Richard's benign thunder. Consciousness is the ability to relate self and other, a phenomena that transpires from the smallest of atoms to the mightiest of deities. There is a watcher in some degree in all manifest existence. There is a flow of experience throughout all dimensions, real or unreal.
God likes to watch.
I think St. Francis of Assisi put it better when he said, "What you are looking for is what is looking." And the interplay of self and other, the watcher and experience, is the fountainhead of all that ever was, is, and will be. Consciousness is the real God above God, my beloved true seekers, and the Gnostics would agree to a good extent, as I shall explain. Heck, the Gnostics were probably as obsessed, or more obsessed than any school of thought with the mystery of consciousness. C.G. Jung and other scholars agreed that the Gnostic were history's first death psychologists, and they dug deep.
It's such an honor. I have been to the dark side. I have seen a world that no man should see.
Really, for most people, it was a rather pleasant experience.
Going back to Richard, he furthermore makes the daring declaration that consciousness should be the true divinity for humanity in a postmodern era where the sacred and secular are so apart, the collective psyche is falling into a chasm of fragmented sanity.
Advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
Richard writes that consciousness is the one issue where both mystic and the scientists, both the atheist and the theist, are in basic agreement of its ineffable nature and boundless possibility for discovery. Shamans in all their incarnations have been map-questing the endless tundras of consciousness for millennia. Yet intellectuals of all materialistic stripes are doing much of the same thing today, and are just in awe of it as the occultist or hierophant. Richard gives plenty of examples in the dice game of Shiva, but one I can give you comes from the atheist bishop, Sam Harris, who happens to be a neuroscientist to boot. Harris admits in his best-selling book, The End of Faith, which I thoroughly enjoyed, that consciousness is one dilemma no modern unspiritual thinker can solve. Let's be realistic. There will be more than likely never an artificial intelligence, a synthetic being that can relate self to other, that is a watcher watching the experience.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Richard, from the highly recommended The Dice Game of Shiva, will expand your consciousness on the mystery of consciousness, which is what we ultimately thrive for as truth seekers and free thinkers. And like I said, Richard's work certainly echoes the Gnostic view to a certain degree.
It's not what you know, it's what you can prove.
Perhaps the best illustration is in the Nag Hammadi scripture many academics call the complete Gnostic ideology from beginning to end. That is the secret book of John. In this saga, the Apostle John languishes in a cave, crying after his boyfriend has been hung on a tree. But then the resurrected Logos appears to the beloved disciple, aka Mary Magdalene, to tell him the pre-creation story. And boy, can the Gnostic Jesus talk.
Finally, they determine Christ is crazy, but he's also gaining power, converting a lot of people to his beliefs, so they kill him. But his disciples keep the secret and hide it from civilization until man could develop a science sophisticated enough to prove what Christ was saying.
And don't forget that you can take this mythopoeia as psychological, inspirational, philosophical, or even literal. That's up to you as an individual.
You're all individuals! Yes, we're all individuals!
Before the beginning, in a timeless realm existed the One, a traditional Platonic appellation for the primordial, taintless Godhead that cannot be described. The One can be related to the Kabbalist notion of Aeon or nothingness, the Ungrund of Jacob Boehm, the alien god of Marcion, Vishnu in Hinduism or Nirvana in Buddhism. For reasons I will explain in a moment, an ultra-cosmic Big Bang transpires in the infinite stillness of the One. For a lack of better words, this complete unconscious consciousness becomes aware. Awareness, by definition, entails the creation of duality. An other must become present. The One achieves self-reflective self-consciousness. The One becomes the Father, also known as the Virgin Spirit. Stephen Davis, in his book on this gospel, puts it better by saying, "The Father has perceived his own image within his own light, and the act of perception, that awareness of himself, has come into being as a provisionally separate entity. This other, this awareness, manifests itself as Bar Below, or the Mother, or the First Man." Don't forget that in mythology, switching or confusing genders is as commonplace as a British 80s rock band.
I'm gonna need so much therapy after this!
There is now consciousness and awareness, instead of the Hindu notion of consciousness and experience. But we're walking a theological razor's edge here. The other distinction is that the interaction between the virginal spirit and Bar Below, although similar to Shiva and Parvati's tryst, Richard will expound on in the interview, is closer to the Greek myth of Narcissus, because the genesis of this ultra-cosmic Big Bang are brought about when the One stirs, awakens because of an underlying love and curiosity with its holy everlastingness. And Bar Below, the personified symptom to this love and curiosity, sensually gazes into the endless light water of the Virgin Spirit and begins to ask about his attributes.
I reveal myself to myself, and I am drenched and purged.
The Father answers by bringing forth these attributes into personhoods and potentials. These are the Aeons of the Pleroma, the fullness of the divine, the mind of God expanding itself. This supreme first date without protection delivers such aeons as foreknowledge, truth, incorruptibility, and more. Yet this Gnostic romance divorces itself from other religions because a celestial motherboard crash happens when the procreation of the aeons extends too far from the original font, even though paradoxically there is no space and time. It's more of a psychological, instantaneous process. The last of the Aeons, Sophia or Wisdom, commits a transgression by exercising her own power of creation without the consent of the Virgin Spirit and Bar Below.
Idle hands are the devil's playground.
The secret book of John gives no explanation, but other texts and traditions, like On the Origins of the World, the Pistis Sophia, and the Valentinian Cosmogony, offer various possibilities why the wisdom of God corrupted the mental process of the ultimate consciousness, love and curiosity being certainly two reasons. Needless to say, this begins the first and true fall, the birthing of time and space, matter and antimatter, and Allah and his endless attempts at mimicking the perfect kingdom above with crappy results.
God isn't interested in technology. He knows nothing of the potential of the microchip or the Silicon Revolution. Look how he spends his time. 43 species of parrots. Nipples for men.
Other Gnostic accounts give various interpretations of the celestial motherboard crash, sometimes with a Sophia-like starlet, sometimes casting different actors like the Logos, the Soul, the Prince, and others. The Gospel of the Egyptians, the Primorphic Pretanoia, and the Exegesis of the Soul are good examples. The Hermetical position relates his fall in a softer tone with much less pathos, but like with the Secret Book of John, borrows heavily from Platonism and the myth of Narcissus. But what all classic Gnostic yarns describes is the same. There was once an ultimate consciousness that by some error or miscalculation dismantled into smaller versions of itself that became lost in a territory of shadow and illusion. This happens to all of us in our daily lives, my beloved truth seekers. We fail to use all of our capabilities in unison, lose our wisdom, and end up lost in a delusional, egoic reality of our own making.
We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't. We're slowly learning that fact. We're very, very pissed off.
Manichaeism, the largest of all the Gnostic faiths, takes a different approach than the Alexandrian heretics. In a realm of yin and yang, it is darkness and its infernal principalities that becomes conscious, then aware, and then envious of the slumbering province of light until it is attacked. We could say that the prophet Mani surmised that consciousness, becoming conscious, was not a good thing in itself. Better to remain in wholeness and bliss instead of daring the perils and opportunities of self-discovery. Perhaps the earliest of the Gnostic parables on consciousness is the Simonian narrative. In it, the great power or God conceives his first thought, or ennoia in Greek, who then sets about to craft the multiverse for his pleasure, but is ultimately betrayed by hired barista angels who want her immeasurable power. They enslave the ennoia and hide her in flesh and curse her with everlasting reincarnation, one of her first punishments being Ellen of Troy. Thus the great power becomes a savior in the shape of Simon Magus.
What's your point?
As you can see, the Gnostic love story between the Virgin Spirit and Barbelo, Simon Magus and Ellen, Jesus and Mary Magdalene, never ends and resounds in all aspects of reality and imagination. A personal lesson for all of you to interpret beyond what I've babbled about. Again, there are more varying interpretations of the self and other Gnosticism, but they all involve a breakdown and eventual rescue operation, or therapy.
Just because there are things I don't remember doesn't make my actions meaningless. The world doesn't just disappear when you close your eyes, does it?
In a Jungian sense, we can simply say that the divine spark is just a fly speck of the collective consciousness tragically separated. This differs from the Eastern view of creation, the expression of consciousness understanding itself. That, as Alan Watts explained, is more of a playful game than a serious drama. Krishna created the universe simply to understand himself, as is often said.
Good luck with that enlightenment stuff.
But enough of my drivel by Odin's beard. The brilliant Richard Smalley on the mystery of consciousness that will leave you more conscious than ever before, based on his enigmatic, piercing new book, The Dice Game of Shiva. This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us today we have the very erudite Richard Smalley to discuss his new book, The Dice Game of Shiva. How are you doing today, Richard?
I'm great. Thank you very much for having me on again, Miguel.
The pleasure's all mine as usual. Well, why don't we start with the basics? How would you define consciousness, which is the central point of your book?
Right. Well, the subtitle of this book, The Dice Game of Shiva, or Shiva, depending on how you prefer it, is How Consciousness Creates the Universe. Now, consciousness has been a very difficult thing to define, and the definitions are either very vague or meaningless or rather circular. What is consciousness? Well, it's awareness. Well, what is that? Well, it's perception. What is that? Well, it's consciousness. If you pick up a book by some contemporary philosopher, you'll get some sort of thing like, well, we know what consciousness is. Consciousness is sort of like a computer, which of course tells us exactly nothing. So I'm starting the book with, I think, a very simple, but I think very fertile definition, which is consciousness is the capacity to relate self and other. without the capacity to relate self and other, there's no consciousness. To take a simple example from our day-to-day experience, in a state of dreamless sleep, you're not aware of a self and other, therefore you're said to be unconscious. Now, you're not totally unconscious because, for example, your consciousness somehow reappears in the morning. Moreover, one of the most commonly prescribed remedies for illness of all kinds is sleep. And sleep, particularly in its deep dreamless form, enables the self of the body to fight off the other of the pathogens. So consciousness in this sense is relative. We think of full consciousness in our own state as what we experience in waking life, dream consciousness, something in between, dreamless sleep, something else. But if you go with that definition of consciousness as the capacity to relate self and other, you start to realize that nothing can really exist without some version of this. You can certainly see that animals have consciousness of a kind. Even plants have some kind of rudimentary consciousness, although it's not, kind of an introspective ego consciousness. And going simpler into more inanimate forms, do they possess this consciousness? Well, they do seem to have the capacity to relate some kind of self, that is whatever they are, to this other that is the world. A hydrogen atom, which nobody usually thinks of as being conscious, has the capacity to relate itself, say, to an oxygen atom under certain circumstances to form a molecule of water, or it takes two hydrogen atoms or whatever. If we go with this perspective, suddenly consciousness is not some anomaly that kind of blipped into human life, when the first chimp used the first tool or something like that. But it's something that's organic to the universe and exists at all levels of the universe. And at that point, human consciousness is not perhaps as unique. On the other hand, it's also less anomalous and less difficult to explain. It's one level or form of, an immeasurable immeasurable spectrum of consciousness that extends from, shall we say, the simplest, most primitive, smallest things to, levels beyond which we can conceive.
And Richard, why do you believe that consciousness should be, as you write, quote, the central concept at any portrait of an intelligible universe?
Well, because for anything to exist, it has to have some kind of sense of self versus an other. That is to say, any chemical structure you posit has to have some kind of cohesion, which means that it must have some sense, however primitive and however unlike our own, of what constitutes itself versus this other that it is not. Otherwise, you're reduced to viewing the whole world as, well, it's all just a soup or it's all a dream in my imagination, which, no philosopher seriously has really ever wanted to stay with for very long in a very pure form.
How does the myth of Shiva playing dice with his capricious bride Parvati help us understand the mystery of consciousness?
I think it illustrates the dynamic of this relationship of self and other in a very subtle and profound way. To put the whole matter in slightly different terms, there are only two things in the universe: that which experiences and that which is experienced. Everything that you know and I know falls into the second category. Some of it seems to be private, some of it seems to be public, but nonetheless it is experienced. So then there's this experiencer, and you can never really see it because it's doing the seeing. This is illustrated in the myth of Shiva and Parvati. Shiva and Parvati are, at the beginning of the myth, locked in the raptures of eternal lovemaking. And then this sinister yogi named Narada shows up and says, well, this is all very well and good, but I can show you something even more fun than that. And he teaches them this dice game, which is probably a primitive form of what we today call parcheesi. And they get enraptured in this game. And curiously enough, Shiva always loses. He may be ahead for a round or two, but he always loses. And he gets down to betting what seem to be his essential symbols, his most essential properties, his trident, which is one of his most famous symbols, and so on. And he loses all of those, so he loses everything. And at this point, he says, all right, well, so I lost everything. I don't have any problem with that. And he goes off to live the life of an ascetic. And then the story goes on to where Parvati sort of has to lure him back in the guise of a voluptuous tribeswoman who in the Hindu caste system were ranked as untouchables. So something forbidden but enticing. In this myth, you could say, Shiva symbolizes the experiencer, that is to say, consciousness. Why does it always lose? Because everything it experiences belongs to what it has experienced. It all belongs to Parvati. It has nothing of its own. But on the other hand, it doesn't matter. It's eternal and deathless, like the god Shiva. So it's not ultimately problematic. To take this further, beyond the myth proper, we realize that consciousness is always somehow enmeshed in its contents. That is to say, to use a phrase that you hear every now and then, you become what you behold. You identify with your experience. You think you're your experience. In a very simple sense, take your thoughts and emotions. Now, anything you experience like this, however personal, private, intimate, however me, is something you can't actually step back and look at. Most people are not used to doing this, and I would say that a good number of meditative practices are designed to develop and refine this capacity. But even so, it's possible. You can watch all your thoughts, all your feelings, all your desires, almost like images on a screen. The screen, the images are Parvati. The watcher is Shiva. It can think it's all of these things. It can get lost and buried in them. But it also has the capacity to step back and liberate itself from them. And I think that's what the myth is talking about. I think that's what many types of mystical philosophy are pointing toward. Most of them would not necessarily use the terms I've used, I've used basic English terms up to this point. But if you become familiar with Hindu philosophy, what I'm talking about is the experiencer, is called Purush or Purusha, which you could say is consciousness in a pure form, that which is the witness. Everything that is experienced, no matter whether it's inside, outside, good or bad, big or small, is called Prakriti, which is usually translated as something like nature, but it's far beyond nature as we usually conceive it, because it consists of visible and invisible worlds, as well as the nature of the birds and bees and so on. And it's this dynamic between the experiencer and the experience, between Shiva and Parvati, between Purush and Prakriti, that not only makes the world, but in a sense makes it in the problematic form that we know it as.
And this myth, you also relate that this myth can be expanded to other mythologies. You, for example, write that the story of Christ can be the same mythology, right? Or the myth of Osiris.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, certainly the story of Christ is the most familiar one in our entire civilization. And here, what I'm calling Purush, this consciousness, descends to earth. And what happens to it? Well, it gets crucified on a cross, and this cross is known as time and space. But again, it doesn't really matter. Just as with Shiva losing all his attributes to Parvati, it doesn't really matter. It rises again on the third day in a new and better form. That is to say, consciousness, mind, becomes lost in this world. It suffers, or appears to suffer in any case. But in the end, it's still there. This experiencer, which is proper not only to us as individuals, but to everything, because it only experiences, is in a sense eternally unaffected. It just witnesses. The Tibetan Buddhists will often use the image of the crystal mirror. that reflects all of these experiences that have themselves no, substance apart from the fact that they're just experience. Osiris is another example. Osiris dies and is dismembered. Usually you'll see in these myths something like that sinister yogi Narada set in the Osiris myth, who's his kind of evil brother who kills him and dismembers him, that represents these forces of division and destruction to which the hero is somehow submitted, but in a sense it doesn't really make any difference. If you go back and look at the hero myth as outlined in Joseph Campbell's books, well, the hero myth has two possible endings. One is that the hero triumphs. The other is that he's killed and he's reborn in some other, usually improved form. So in a sense, Shiva, Christ, Osiris can't lose. They can only appear to lose, in a certain kind of short term or from a certain perspective.
Yes, and Parvati, as you write, she also represents the famous world soul, which kind of reminds me of the mythology of Simon Magus and Helen of Tyre. She represents the first soul or the first thought.
Those Gnostic myths are a little different in one sense, and the metaphors get tricky because a female character doesn't necessarily symbolize the same thing in every myth. I would say that Sophia and the Gnostic myths are equivalent to Purusha in the Hindu myths. That is to say, and originally, this is in 1 Corinthians, Christ is called the Sophia of God. Sophia in the Gnostic myths is this principle of consciousness. Again, it gets lost. It gets buried. To use the Gnostic myths, it prostitutes itself. The kind of proto-Gnostic Simon Magus claimed he found the reincarnation of Helen of Troy's, working in a whorehouse in Tyre. For him, this was symbolic of the bondage of mind or consciousness. So it's a little different. The myth is basically the same. It's just that the female character symbolizes something different in some of those myths.
But staying just a little bit longer on the Gnostic myth, would you see Shiva and Parvati being the same, more or less, as the Sethian myth of the virginal spirit and bar below?
It's a little hard to say. I don't remember that specific Sethian myth well enough to really draw exact parallels. But the Gnostic teachings as a whole always speak of this thing called Sophia or consciousness, sometimes wisdom. In the Hymn of the Pearl and in the Acts of Thomas, it's a pearl that's buried at the bottom of the sea. All of these things resemble aspects of consciousness that somehow get lost in its own experience. Again, you think you are what you behold. In the Pistis Sophia, which is kind of one of the longest and most kind of elaborate and Baroque Gnostic texts, has Sophia kind of being liberated in these progressive symbolic stages as described by Christ to his disciples.
Going back to the Hindu myths, you write a lot about Samkhya. Could you explain its dualism and how it's different than other types of dualism, or as you call it, persistence?
Samkhya is the oldest philosophical system in the world. It's a Hindu system. It is believed even by many scholars of Hinduism to be extinct or kind of been more accurately absorbed by other systems. But apparently it does still survive in pure forms in various places, in isolated places in India. I have no connection with any of these schools myself. I found the Samkhya philosophy and kind of dwelt on it because it seemed closest to my own insights and discoveries, and it provided me with a more effective vocabulary for talking about a lot of these things than Western philosophy or even a lot of other schools of esoteric thought. But for the Samkhya, it's basically what I said. Purusha, and the terms Purusha and Prakriti are from the Samkhya. Purusha is consciousness. It can appear multiple because we do seem to have multiple selves, but this is only true from a certain relative level. Prakriti is this whole dynamic world that manifests as a result of being experienced. By the way, although usually Purusha is symbolized as male, as Shiva, Prakriti, nature, is symbolized as female, as in Parvati. Nonetheless, one has to be a little careful about going too far with metaphors, because every metaphor is going to be accurate only up to a certain degree. In this case, although most of the time people associate the feminine with something completely passive, it is not the case in this philosophy. Prakriti is the total active force of the universe. Everything that moves, all the energy that's kind of keeps everything going belongs to Prakriti. It does not belong to Purusha, which is ever still and silent and just a witness. The energy that keeps this going, kind of the motive force of the entire universe, is in some Hindu systems called Shakti. That's a name for it. It doesn't happen to appear in the Samkhya as such, but it fits in very well with it. So I was drawn to this just because it expressed my own thoughts and ideas clearly. I did send the dice game of Shiva to a well-known Samkhya expert, and I asked him, well, look, how accurate is this from a scholar's point of view? And he seemed to think it was basically fairly accurate. He didn't offer any corrections in any case. So I think this is reasonably close to this tradition. Now, here's another little thing about the Samkhya, which is this totally obscure, unknown Hindu philosophy. It can be linked with another extremely well-known form of Hindu philosophy, which is yoga. And these are today, if you look at the textbooks of Indian philosophy, Sankhya and yoga are different schools. They're different perspectives or darshans. Originally, they weren't. And there's a verse in the Bhagavad Gita in which Krishna said, who thinks Sankhya and yoga are two different things is in error, because they are the same. Really, originally, the Sankhya was the theory, and the yoga, and I don't mean yoga as, a bunch of stretching exercises for a bunch of, comfortable middle-aged ladies, which is sort of what it's become. But yoga as a strict meditative discipline was the practice, and Sankhya was the theory. So it's interesting. I mean, they're divorced now, and they've gone their own separate ways. But originally, and in the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the greatest of all Indian scriptures, basically says, no, they're the same.
Yeah, and what's interesting, as you point out, is that Samkhya differs from the Vedantas in that, I guess, mainstream Hinduism, Maya does not exist and is dependent on Brahma.
Right.
But in Samkhya, Prakriti or experience is not dependent on Purusha. They are both separated and coexisting, right? Yeah,
it gets subtle, but I think the basic difference comes down to this: Advaita Vedanta, non-dualist Vedanta, which is by far the most familiar form of Hindu philosophy in the United States, says something like this: all experience is illusion, is Maya. Maya means something like illusion. Samkhya is saying that, well, no, you can't really go that far, because the world is Shiva's experience, and Shiva's experience is real insofar as it goes. The error or illusion that the Vedantins see, I would say, is more in imagining all of these discrete bits of the world existing in isolation, or your own consciousness existing in isolation from all others. So it's a subtle dynamic. I mean, you can see the Samkhya with its insistence on experiencer and experienced. Purusha and Prakriti is dualistic. But as you say, it's not like dualism in other senses. One, if you take Philosophy 101 at college, you hear the term dualism. It usually refers to Descartes' dualism. That is to say, there's mind and there's body, and they have nothing to do with each other. That's really something quite different. The other is religious dualism, exemplified by things like Manichaeism, Zoroastrianism, where the universe is not, in a sense, the creation of one God, but it's kind of this interplay between these forces of light and dark and good and evil. One difference between these forms of dualism and the kind I'm talking about is that the kind I'm talking about doesn't really ascribe moral attributes to one or the other. There's Purusha and Prakriti, experience and experience. One is not good and the other is not evil. They just are what they are. And the world is not some kind of creation, some kind of war between, good and evil as the way some of these other religions portrayed it. So that is one difference that needs to be emphasized. I mean, when you hear a lot of people talking, in kind of alternative spirituality circles, particularly ones that have been influenced by Eastern philosophy, you have this thing that's extolled, this vague entity called non-dualism, which is somehow good. And then there's this thing called dualism, which is somehow bad. But you can see that that's a bit of a joke, because to think about it, one thing, non-dualism being good and dualism being bad is itself dualistic.
Very true.
In fact, if you look at the word non-dualism, it itself is dualistic, right? Because there's this thing called dualism, whatever it is, and there's this thing that you're supposedly espousing, which is not. All of which is to say that when you're talking about the world of appearances, and that's, in a sense, all we can talk about or deal with conceptually, dualism isn't so easy to avoid. The traditions like the Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism of certain types are right in pointing us to some levels where this doesn't really apply. But in anything that we're talking about on a day-to-day basis, even a lot of our own internal, even a lot of our own meditative experience, it basically does. And I think one just has to be honest about that and not get hung up on somehow dualism being evil and for some reason that you don't entirely understand.
Yeah, and Richard, but this definitely would beg the question, especially somebody from Western traditions, which would be, why do we have this separation or interplay? In Christianity, you have a fall or a fragmenting. You've got either Satan or Adam and Eve. And in Gnosticism, you obviously have the fall of Sophia, the cosmic tragedy. In the Kabbalah, you've got the breaking of the first Adam Kadmon and then the Tikkun Olam. Does the Samkhya explain why this happened? I know the Vedantas don't do a good job of it, as you say.
To begin with, one difference between Eastern and Western religions and philosophies, broadly speaking, this is an overgeneralization, but I think it has a certain value, is that while we all see something problematic in the world, there's something wrong with the world. Human beings are creatures who believe something is wrong. In the Western systems, this is usually viewed in moral terms. The primordial sin of mankind, whatever that was, the fall in Eden, and so on. In the East, this problematic nature of the universe, of our own human condition, tends to be viewed more in cognitive terms. That is to say that there's something we don't recognize, or there's something we're kind of just missing that is making us see things funny. Now, Plato said something like this, so I said it's not a blanket distinction between East and West, but it's a generalization that's certainly worth keeping for at least briefly. Now, the minute you have the sense of self and other, this kind of separation arises. There's you and then there's not you. Well, what sort of response is possible when you have this kind of split like this? Well, you can either go toward it, you can go away from it, or you can do neither. Buddhists call these the three poisons, desire, anger, and obliviousness, or equivalent terms. The Samkhya speaks of the three gunas, which means something like principles and are somewhat equivalent to that. So the minute you have this dichotomy, this sense of self and other, however subtle, all sorts of other forces get going. And moreover, consciousness, the experiencer somehow thinks it's separate from this other, and it doesn't know what sort of stance to take toward it. The Samkhya and yoga philosophers will say, well, there's a certain amount of detachment that's necessary. the experiencer, and the experience is not as enmeshed and not as problematic. That's why so many of these religions and pretty much all mystical teachings in one way or another preach non-attachment as a central aspect of their paths.
Yeah, but the separation in the Samkhya is what is called the ahamkara.
Yeah.
And that is the ego.
Right.
That is naruda. That is that thing that breaks the two apart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the thing about it is that if you get yourself, if consciousness gets itself into a kind of frozen stance toward its own experience, it starts to think of itself as an isolated I. Ahamkara literally means I amness. And then there's this whole world around you which is kind of alien and possibly hostile. To go back to the Gnostic myths, I think that's what they're saying. And in the Gnostic myths, what the Samkhya calls ahankara, I amness, egohood, is symbolized by Ayaldabaoth, who, imagines that he's self-generated. He's says, I am God and there's no other. There's a certain kind of insecurity in him, and that he sort of says that. And that's the situation of the ego. That is to say, it feels itself as alone. It's sort of fixed on to certain aspects of experience, and somehow it clings on to these, imagining that that's what it is. And in order to free itself from that kind of bondage to its own experience, the meditative practice, the intellectual analysis of certain types of jnana yoga are necessary. By the way, I mean, and I want to emphasize this because Americans in general have a rather contempt for intellectualism. That is to say, this is all a bunch of ideas, but what does it have to do with me? You could say that's some of the things I'm talking about and trying to accomplish here are exercises in jnana yoga or jnana yoga, J-N-A-N-A, which is the yoga of, to some degree, intellectual speculation. That is to say, you're using philosophical speculation not as a way of getting a dissertation or saying clever things, but by this very process of thinking this through to reach some kind of cognitive illumination or liberation or gnosis.
Yeah, and what I love, a lot of things I loved about your book is you explain in a very cogent, almost scientific way, which would be very satisfying to the mystics and other esotericists, that the planes of existence, whether it be the dream world, the astral world, heaven, hell, or whatever, are basically the degrees of identification between Purusha and Prakriti.
Yeah, that's a very accurate and articulate summation. Yeah, there are different levels of identification. There are different levels of, shall we say, bondage. You'll notice that in our waking human life, the sense of what is self and what is other is reasonably clear and reasonably fixed. You aren't me and I'm not you. I mean, we're all one, as everybody says, but somehow nobody really means it. Or if they do mean it, they don't even really know what they mean by it. But look at the dream experience that you have. The sense of self and other, and even the difference between different others, is not always that clear. There's this figure in the dream, and it's sort of you, it's sort of not you. It's your best friend, but it's not really your best friend. It's your mother, but it's not really your mother. Whatever kind of psychoanalysis you may want to apply to all of that, you can see just from what I've said, the distinction of self and other is a little bit looser in a dream. Now, the mystical traditions would say that that's another plane of experience. That is to say, it's real to the degree, you had this dream. It's not real in the sense that other people are going to accept it in waking life, except, no reason to disbelieve this person had this dream, but it's not taken quite as seriously, but it's still your experience. The mystical traditions are saying that we live in kind of a universe of many different planes, going from the very, very, very subtle to the very, very dense, which human life on Earth is said to be somewhere kind of the middle of all of this. And hell, which are these symbols of these lower states of being, is often depicted in some kind of frozen or inert state. There's one circle of Dante's hell in which all these people are kind of buried up to their necks in ice. So at that level, self and other, the consciousness is really enslaved to its contents. At our level, it's kind of in the middle range. In the dream world, it's less so, although its experience is that much less stable for that reason. And then you get up to the higher levels, which the Kabbalists call, the level of Bria, the world of creation. The Buddhists would call the Arupa forms, the formless realms, where there is something still experienced, but it's much more nebulous. It doesn't even really have the kind of shape that an image in a dream has. And esoteric thought is devoted to exploring all of this and getting to know it better. All the while admitting that, in terms of our own human experience, what's available to us as human beings, it's still very little. With esotericism and mysticism, you're opening it up a little bit, and you're exploring, several floors of this, infinite building rather than just confining yourself to one.
But Richard, if consciousness, as you write, is the fragment of the cosmic self that animates us, how does it play into the notions of an afterlife and divine justice?
That's a good question. When people say the self is illusory, what they're saying is that, in my opinion, is that consciousness is bound itself to a fairly limited, bundle of experiences. And the Buddhists even talk about these bundles. They'll use the word bundles, which in Sanskrit is skandhas. And death, transformation, all these types is this loosening of this bondage to all of this. The personal self, well, is the personal self going to survive death? Well, I don't know how much. Setting aside everything we've talked about for the last 45 minutes, is the personal self going to survive? What of you is your personal self? What of it do you expect to survive? Will you be a Republican or a Democrat after you're dead? Will you still like ice cream when you don't have a body to taste it with? What will happen to all your opinions and your morals and whatnot? Most of them will be gone because even if there is something like a sense of personal self, they'll no longer be relevant. What the mystical traditions are saying, in essence, is that silent experiencer in you, that which says I but goes even deeper than I, is what's really immortal. And because it's immortal, it's universal, it's at our core what is identical to what we have with everybody else. So then you really start getting into the language of paradox, because that which is most me, most deeply set at the core of one's being, is precisely that which you share with everybody else. And then, language starts to, bend and break under these concepts because, English is a language of, three pronoun persons, I, you, and he, she, or it. And it doesn't really do justice to this terribly well. The concepts of personal survival themselves probably don't do justice to this very well. In terms of the justice of the universe, one thing about Prakriti, the soul of the world, the nature in all forms, visible and invisible, and in the astral realm, as well as here on Earth, is that it does seem to have a certain quality of inertia. That is to say, something that happens has a tendency to happen again. It's possible to become kind of embedded in this, so that if consciousness gets enmeshed in its experience and identifies with it and starts to do evil things, it will start to have evil consequences. This is what karma is saying. If it will do good things, it will have good consequences. And you notice in a lot of mystical thought, particularly that of the East, there's a certain ambivalence even toward good deeds. It's not so much that they're discouraged, but there's a certain sense in which even these can kind of just lead to the same kind of whirligig, even if it's just a nicer one. The solution usually is preached as a form of detachment. And that's what you see in the Bhagavad Gita. It takes place on this battlefield. Arjuna, the hero, doesn't really want to participate in this battle, not out of cowardice, but because the whole thing starts to seem pointless. And Krishna, who's his charioteer, says, no, you have to do it anyway. This is what you're here for. But you have to perform your action with, dispassion and detachment. And I think that's what a lot of these traditions are trying to tell us. They're not saying not to do anything. They're saying not to be good. They're saying, to do your good in a somewhat impersonal way. You see echoes of this in the Gospels where, Christ criticizes the Pharisees for doing things, just out of expectation for some kind of reward from God. That, in a sense, is the justice of the universe, that these patterns perpetuate themselves, and some of these are decidedly more unpleasant than others. So as a result, it may be best not to perpetuate some of the most unpleasant ones, and also to have a certain, at least, inner freedom toward even the good that you do.
Going a little bit back to the West, is there any room for faith in the light of consciousness, especially since consciousness in a postmodern world can be understood theologically, philosophically, empirically, scientifically, and yes, experientially?
It's like there's a joke about the kid who says, faith is believe in what you know ain't so. In that sense, no, there's no room for faith. Faith is not adhering to, in any meaningful sense, it's not adhering to a set of propositions that really make no sense to you just because believing them will serve as kind of insurance policy for the afterlife. And that's kind of what much of religion, particularly Christianity, has deteriorated into. But if you want to say go back to the Bible, one of the most famous definitions of faith is in the Epistle of the Hebrews, where it says it's the experience of things unseen, the substance of things hoped for. Now, there's something powerful in this, and I would say that each of us knows that there is something more than this kind of narrow world that we live in. In some way or another, this conviction, and faith originally meant conviction, that there is something more and that you have to follow this in some sort of way. It's knowing this, even though, what the dogmas and the preaching and the scriptures and all that sort of thing, in the end may ring somewhat hollow. But there's something, as one of the characters says in Thornton Wilder's Archhound, there is something that's eternal, and that something has to do with human beings. Now, that is an intuitive sense we all have, I believe. It does not necessarily mean faith in a personal God as normally conceived, but I think it's nonetheless real. Now, where does God fit in all of this? Well, I've talked about this duality between self and other, between Purusha and Prakriti, which seems to be somehow organic to the universe as we know it and can talk about it. But there seems to be this ground out of which self and other arise that very difficult to put your finger on because it's not self or other. On the other hand, you can experience it as self or other. And the great religions do this in different ways. The mystical ones, and these have been found in all religions, realize at some point, I am is God. I am is the way, the truth, and the life. I am is the door. I am is the true vine. That's the mystical meaning of those verses in the Gospel of John. Now, it's not your personal I, but that in you which says I am is sort of your link to universal consciousness. So in a sense, and I say this in a sense because it doesn't refer to the personal ego, but in a sense, the self is God. Now, on the other hand, there's God experienced as, I believe it was some theologian like Paul Tillich, God is totally other. Well, God can also be experienced as other, as something that's not you, because God gives rise to both of this. God can be experienced in both ways. It can be experienced personally and impersonally, so on and so on. So, you're going past faith in a propositional sense. You're going more toward faith in what do I know is really true for me? What do I really know about all of this? as a somewhat of a sideline, there's a common criticism voiced usually by traditional religious types of the New Age affinity for, what's called supermarket spirituality, picking and choosing what you like out of religions. And this is supposed to be sort of a bad thing. But no, I think it's not only a good thing, I think in a way it's obligatory. If you're going to really be authentic to yourself, this religious teaching makes sense to me up to this point. This part doesn't make sense to me. We're not at an age anymore where you sort of have to sign on the dotted line the whole, creed or the whole 39 articles or whatever. No, the individual has, the right and the duty, in a sense, to say, well, this does make sense in terms of my experience, as long as you're honest about it. That is to say, as long as you're talking, really about your truth and not some kind of, people can talk themselves into believing in anything, as you know. But I think that's where faith lies. It is this kind of inner knowing, and I think faith is ultimately kind of a portal to gnosis or knowing.
Richard, it seems that the crux of your book, and you say it's already happening, is that consciousness can be a bridge between the widening divide of scientism, materialism, and religion and mysticism. Consciousness can replace the perhaps outdated static God images of so many faiths while giving science a sense of the sublime. Am I far off on this?
No, I think you expressed what I was trying to say, again, quite accurately. If you go back to saying consciousness is sense of self versus other, even if it's defining consciousness more broadly than is often done, a scientist, even a radical materialist can sort of say, well, yeah, if you define consciousness in that way, I can go along with you up to that point. I think you can take it further than that, although I don't think you necessarily have to. In any case, what we are doing at this point as a civilization is trying to explore the nature of consciousness and trying to find out what it is. Now, I guess my own view is that it's always going to be somewhat beyond explanation. No one is ever going to be able to find it because it's always that which is doing the discovering. It's not quite the same thing as some element that can be isolated and looked at in a laboratory. You can't find it without having someone or something doing the finding, which is consciousness. I'm saying that the definition I've suggested for it strikes me as a lot more organically true than many of the current ones, which seem very artificial and empty or circular. But I think also people are really trying to explore what is the mind, and whether or not they agree with me particularly. I think this exploration in many forms, whether it's through neurology or cybernetics, the whole world of computer science, that kind of thing, psychology, philosophy, even theology's kind of been skittish about going in this direction. I think that will be one of the central themes of our civilization in the foreseeable future.
And lastly, personal question: what forms or what techniques have worked for you in your life to be able to expand your consciousness, or even sometimes you say contract your consciousness, which can be good for you? What has worked for you, Richard?
Well, I think meditation, certainly been a central part of my path. It's something I've done for 30 years in different forms. For a long time, I did what could be described as a kind of Kabbalistic mantra meditation. I think it is necessary, in a sense, to be able to focus your mind. I mean, more speaking personally, I've been doing kind of Dzogchen meditation. Dzogchen is kind of the great perfection of Tibetan Buddhism, which the directions are to kind of rest in pure awareness. So you're not so much focusing your consciousness anymore as you're trying to expand it and include everything in it, and, with various things in between. And I think without this kind of meditative insight, it would have been much more difficult for me to come up with all of this. Now, there's spontaneous insight, and then there's kind of what the mind does with spontaneous insight. Thinking about it, I think, is useful, reading about it. Going back to what I was saying earlier, I mean, a lot of what this is an attempt at jnana yoga, which is trying to use the mind and speculation and kind of intellectual activity, not just as kind of a game, but as a way of kind of contributing to your own awakening. And I think that's been, quite central to my path. I wouldn't pretend that it's the same for everybody. The traditions are always saying, well, there are these people who are more interested in this kind of jnana yoga. There are these people who are more interested in the bhakti devotional side, the karma, and so on. I think all of these are valuable. I think the mind has to be involved. I think, there's a certain devotional element that has to be involved, at least speaking purely personally. I think the mixture that one adopts for oneself is highly personal. And, I think that's what I found most useful over the years. I've certainly studied various places and, various people and read various things. But, you really do at some point have to try to sort it out for yourself. And that's what this book is the result of.
Well, I think that's all the time we have today, Richard. Again, thank you very much for coming on and discussing the dice game of Shiva, and good luck with the book.
Thank you. Yes, it's been a real pleasure. Yeah, so the book has just come out from New World Library. It's available at all the usual venues. My own website is www.Christianity.com, and talks a little bit more about the book as well as some of my other works and events and appearances and so on.
Well, there you have it. Well, again, thank you very much, Richard, and great to have you on, and have yourself a good day.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
And there you have it, my beloved truth seekers. Richard Smoley on the mystery of consciousness from his book, The Dice Game of Shiva. Both book and interview should be feasted upon more than once to grasp the subtle yet elephant in the room obviousness of consciousness. I know I read his book twice and will read it more times. Richard Smoley's other books include Forbidden Faith, The Secret History of Gnosticism, and Inner Christianity. Richard was also the editor of Nosis magazine for 8 years and is now the editor for Quest Books right here in Chicago. For more information on Richard, please visit his website, innerchristianity.com. And it should be obvious by now that Gnosis entails both an exploration and altering of consciousness by whatever means necessary, as long as nobody loses an eye or genital like Origin did. Gnosis is Bluetoothing our divine spark, our shard of that eternal I, with the great invisible network that is the pleroma. And if consciousness replaces Abraxas as a god above God in the 21st century, so be it. A small tenure I had, I guess. Perhaps there are other creations I can find work until a stimulus plan comes my way. But we are still the Gnostics, the veterans of 1,000 psychic wars in that dark odyssey between the gnashing rocks of orthodoxy. We have taken an unbreakable oath to search the corners of inner and outer galaxies for the whispers of terrifying truths, descend into the lowest pits of a psychic Hades, armed with the sword of reason and the Orpheus harp of compassion, for our dreams and imagination. We are initiated into the mysteries of dark wonder, the painful joy of awakening to the Jezebel song of a higher state of being, and the legacy of our beloved spiritual ancestors, martyred at the stakes by grand inquisitors or by the scalding pens of slanderous lamyas. Jehovah plays his dice games, we play ours. And in some strange way, we both must lose in order to win. I am Abraxas, broadcasting from the virtual Alexandria through the GodAboveGod.com. The road is ended, the song is over. Thought I'd have something more to say. But don't cultivate any troubles, my beloved true seekers, because like heaven above you, the spy that loved you, I'm keeping all of your secrets safe with me tonight. Hello and goodbye as always.
Just hire me to drive the car, sir. I'm not here to tell you who you are.
I didn't ask you to tell me who I am.
You're hinting around about clothes. That happens to be a very important topic to me, sir. Clothes. Mr.
Banks?
Banks. Clothes makes the man. I believe that. You say to me you want to go shopping, want to buy clothes, but you don't know what kind. You leave that hanging in the air like I'm going to fill in the blanks. Now, that to me is like asking me who you are, and I don't know who you are. I don't want to know. It's taken me all my life to find out who I am, and I am tired now. You hear what I'm saying?